Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast. Here we ask a simple question of the history and the actions that have shaped our lives.
Did this leave us more free or more governed? Because what we do not know can be used to govern us.
And what we choose to ignore always will.
Today, we're going to discuss math and logistics of democracy. I'm going to explain the dilemma of 435, the fixed number of the U.S. House of Representatives in a country of 340 million people. So let us begin with a number. The congressional district I live in here in Western Pennsylvania requires the number of human beings that my Congress is to represent, the number of constituents whose interests are to be served by one single member of the People's House in Washington, is 765,403. Imagine being a waiter or waitress at a restaurant and told your section has 750,000 seats. Or if you're a customer support rep and you're told your queue has 765,000 support tickets. Let us measure that number against the people who built the House of Representatives. When the founders designed the chamber they called the People's House, the one branch of the federal government meant to be directly accountable to the people, to ordinary citizens, elected every 2 years, close to the ground, approachable. They wrote into the Constitution itself a limit on how distant a representative could be from the represented. They said a constitutional district should contain no fewer than 30,000 people. 30,000. My representative carries 765,000. And the gap between those two numbers, it's not an accident of history. It is the result of a specific decision made by a specific Congress in a specific year, 1929. And almost no American alive today knows that it happened. On Saturday, we sat with Aristotle and Polybius and Cicero, and we drew from them the idea of the mixed constitution, the one, the few, and the many, set in balance so that no part could devour the whole. And we ended on a question. I asked whether we still have the vox populi, the voice of the people, whether we still have it genuinely present in our own legislative process. Today, I want to answer the question, and the question is going to be a little bit uncomfortable because I'm going to make the case that the democratic element of our mixed constitution, the part the ancients insisted had to be real for the entire structure to work, has been quietly narrowed. And narrowed in two different ways until the voice of the people barely carries it all. This is not a complaint that we have too much democracy. You'll hear that complaint consistently enough from the people who share my politics, and we'll deal with that honestly today. No. This is the opposite worry. The worry that the People's House has been engineered to stop transmitting the people's voice. I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions podcast. This is episode 2, part B of the series, Self-Evident, The Road to 1776. And this is our contemporary application episode connecting the historical principles we explored on Saturday to the policy debates and liberty movement of today. On Saturday, we examined the classical inheritance, Aristotle's science of constitutions, Polybius' cycle of decay, and the doctrine of the mixed constitution that both of them handed to the American founders. Today we ask, how does that ancient idea of the rule of the many apply to our own House of Representatives? And we have, without quite noticing, hollowed out the democratic element the whole design depends on. Let us begin. Let us set the standard before we measure anything against it, because the standard comes straight from Saturday's episode. Aristotle, you'll remember, sorted government by who rules and for whose benefit. and rule by the many in the common interest he called polity. And he thought it one of the three legitimate forms of government. But notice what polity required. It required that the many actually rule, that broad participation be real, not decorative. A constitution in which the many were said to govern, but in which their voice was in fact captured by a narrow few, would not have been polity to Aristotle. Instead, it would have been oligarchy wearing polity's clothing. The label was never the thing. The thing was whether power genuinely sat where the Constitution claimed it sat. And Polybius sharpened this. In his self-deprecating cycle of constitutions, the anacyclosis we walked through on Saturday, the democratic element was indispensable to the mixed constitution that slowed this cycle. Rome endured, Polybius argued, because the consuls, the Senate, and the popular assemblies each held real power and checked the others. Take any one of those three and hollow it out, leave its forms, but drain the substance, and the balance fails. The brake stops working. The wheel begins to turn again. It was mentioned to me in a comment on the video short describing the Polybius anacyclosis. If this is what happens, why even try? Well, we try because as I mentioned in the full video, Polybius believed a mixed constitution could check the propensity of each valid form of government to degrade. And the founders inherited this mindset exactly. When they built the federal government, they built a mixed constitution in the plebeian sense. A president for the one, a senate for the few, and the House of Representatives for the many. And they were emphatic, in their own words, that the House had to be genuinely close to the people. This was not some interpretation I imposed on them. It was their explicit design intention. They argued it in public and during the ratification debates. Listen to how they talked about it. In Federalist 52, the House is described as depending on the great body of the people, with a frequency of elections meant to keep it in immediate dependence on and sympathy with the people. In Federalist 57, the aim is stated plainly that the representatives should have an immediate dependence on and an intimate sympathy with the people secured by frequent elections. The whole theory of the chamber was the closeness, the proximity. A representative who could be known, reached, held accountable, and then turned out of office by citizens who could actually see what he was doing. And here's the part that matters the most for today. At the Constitutional Convention, when the delegates debated how large congressional districts should be, the instincts ran towards smaller, not larger. The Constitution, as it first drafted, set the floor at one representative for every 40,000 people. And on the very last day of the convention, George Washington, who had presided in near total silence for the entire summer, almost never intervening on any substantive question, George Washington rose to speak. The one-time father of the country chose to weigh in on the one content of the Constitution, and it was to argue that 40,000 was too many, that the ratio should be lowered to 30,000 to bring representatives closer to the people. The convention agreed unanimously. That is how the 30,000 figure entered the Constitution. The closest thing we have to direct intervention from Washington himself on the substance of the document was a vote for more representation, for smaller districts, a tighter bond between the citizen and his congressman. 30,000 was the floor. It was not the target. It was the minimum district size, the maximum closeness, if you will. It was not the actual ratio the early republic used. The first house in 1789 actually ended up with 65 members for a nation of around 4 million people. And that works out closer to one representative per 60,000 people. So we're not going to tell you that the founders mandated districts of 30,000 and that we betrayed a sacred number. That would be false. But we are going to tell you this. The founders set 30,000 as the closest a district could be. And they expected the House to keep growing as the population grew. For 120 years, it did. 65 members became 105, became 240, became 391. Every census, the People's House grew, so that even as the country expanded, each representative stayed within reach of his constituents. The growth of the chamber was the mechanism that kept the democratic element democratic. That was the design, and it worked as intended for over a century. And then in 1929, we switched it off. In 1929, here's what happened. And it's one of the strangest and least known turns in American constitutional history. For the first 120 some years of the Republic, every decennial census, Congress passed a reapportionment act that enlarged with the House to keep pace with the growing population. It was nearly automatic. The country grew, the People's House grew with it. By 1911, the House had reached 435 members. Number sounds familiar, right? This was 1911. The 435 members were serving a nation of about 92 million people. Then came the census of 1920. And for the first time in the nation's history, Congress failed to reapportion itself. It simply did not do it. Why? Because the 1929 census recorded something that frightened the sitting members. For the first time, America had become more urban than rural. The population had shifted toward the cities, toward the immigrants, toward the industrial north. And reapportioning the House to reflect that shift would have meant rural districts and rural states losing seats to the cities. The men holding those rural seats did not want to lose them, so they did nothing. For an entire decade, through the 1920s, the House of Representatives stood frozen at its 1911 size. By the end of that time, it was 20 years out of date. A clear constitutional duty, reapportionment after the census, was simply ignored because honoring it was politically inconvenient for the people who would have to honor it. And then in 1929, rather than do the hard thing and reapportion honestly, Congress passed what it called the Permanent Apportionment Act. And the word permanent is the tell. Instead of resuming the founding practice of growing the House with the country, Congress froze the number forever at 435, the figure left over from 1911. And it built an automatic formula to redistribute those fixed seats among the states after any future census. No more debates about enlarging the chamber. No more growth. 435 locked in, regardless of whether the country held 90 million people or 340 million people. Now, let us look back and be fair to the men who did this. These were not some cartoon villains. They had a real problem. The 1920s fight over reapportionment had been genuinely ugly, tangled up with nativism and the urban-rural divide, and had produced a decade of paralysis. The 1925 Act solved that paralysis. It put apportionment on autopilot and ended the deadlock. And there is a respectable argument, I will give it its full strength in a moment, that a legislature has to have some manageable size, that you cannot deliberate in a body of thousands, and that 435 is a defensible number as any. These are real points. I'm not going to pretend the cap was enacted in bad faith or that no argument supports it. But this is consequential action, so let's look at the consequence of that action. What has that cap done over a century since? In 1929, those 435 members served about 122 million people, roughly 280,000 constituents per. Today, those same 435 members serve about 340 million people. And the arithmetic is merciless. The average congressional district now contains about 761,000 people. My district in Pennsylvania, the 17th, contains 765,403. And the dilution is still getting worse, census by census. In fact, after the 2010 count, my district and every district in Pennsylvania was about 707,000. And by 2020, it jumped to 765,000. In 2030, it will jump again, and on and on. The number of people increase. The number of representatives does not. Think about what that means for the design the founders cared about. Again, going back to the purpose of the People's House itself. Washington rose from his chair to argue that 40,000 was too distant, that 30,000 would keep the representative within reach of the represented. And we now ask a single representative to know, to hear, to answer to, and to carry the interest of 765,000 people. I mentioned the analogy to the waiter and waitress and to the technical support tech because a congressman is supposed to serve, is supposed to be there to answer to his constituency, his customers, if you will. To ask any single member to answer to 765,000 individual voices is near impossible. This is not a tweak at the margins of the founding design. It is a 25-fold expansion of the distance between the citizens and the People's House, measured against the closest bond the founders thought a republic ought to maintain. And more than doubling even the ratio that had already existed when the cap was imposed. What does that distance actually do? Well, it does exactly what you would expect. When a district holds 750,000 people, no representative can know it the way a representative could with 30 or 60,000 people. The individual constituent becomes statistically negligible. Your letter to Congress is one of tens of thousands. Your phone call is logged by an intern and tallied. The representative's real attention, well, it flows out of necessity to the actors large enough to register at that scale. The organized donors, the concentrated industries, the national party leadership that controls committee assignments and campaign money, the professional lobbies. The bigger the district, the more the representative is pulled away from the diffuse, unorganized many toward the centralized, organized, and concentrated few. The cap did not just make the districts larger, it changed who a representative has to listen to in order to survive. It pulled the People's House structurally toward the very oligarchy capture that Aristotle warned would hollow polity into something only wearing a polity's clothes. It's the reason why we talked about in the Empire of Liberty series that you could have congressional approval rates hovering in the teens, but an incumbency reelection rate in the 90s. Because you're not answering to the people, you're answering to a different constituency to get reelected. Now, the objection. And let's honor the objection in full strength because it is a serious one and it comes from what I view an unimpeachable source, one of our own favorites from these series. The objection is that a bigger house would not be more democratic. It would be more chaotic. And chaos does not serve the people. It serves whoever controls the chaos. And the man who made that argument and made it the most powerfully was James Madison himself. In Federalist 55, the very essay where he defended the original size of the House, Madison wrote that beyond a certain point, adding members does not increase the wisdom or the voice of an assembly, but its passion and its confusion. His words, they're very sharp. In all very numerous assemblies, of whatever character composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Had every Athenian citizen been a Socrates, every Athenian assembly would still have been a mob. That is Madison, warning that size itself could tip an assembly towards allocracy, the mob rule, the one that Polybius placed at the bottom of the wheel. A house of 6,000, the objection runs, would not be closer to the People's House. It would be an ungovernable crowd in which real power would flee from the members to the leadership, to the staff, and to the committee chairs who alone could compose order. You would have a chamber larger and the individual member weaker, and the concentrated power more than before, not less. It's a complex argument, but it makes sense, and it's the strongest case against my argument. And I'll not pretend that it doesn't have any force. It has real force. But to Madison, here's my answer. Madison was not defending a permanent cap. He could not have been. The idea of freezing the House forever would not have been invented for another 140 years. And Madison's whole life work assumed the chamber would actually grow. In Federalist 55 and 56, he was answering a very specific anti-Federalist charge that the original proposed House, starting at 65 members, was too small to be safe. Madison was defending a floor against demands that would be even lower, and arguing the House would grow with population, which he expected and endorsed. He was adjudicating a fight between 65 members and something larger, in a nation of 4 million. He was not adjudicating the fight we are in, between a House frozen at 435 for a nation of 340 million. And a House allowed to grow as he assumed it always would? The mob, Madison feared, was a single assembly so large that no one could deliberate in it. That's a real concern, and it sets an upper bound. But the distance between 30,000 and 765,000 per House member is enormous. And there's vast room to move much further towards the founding ratio and to cut the district size in half to a third, long before you reach the ungovernable crowd Madison was warning about. The honest reading of Madison does not defend the cap. It defends a sensible middle. And we're nowhere near a sensible middle. We're stranded at the far end of distance, defending a number Congress pulled out of the year 1911 because reapportionment at that time was too problematic. That is the first narrowing principle that I bring up today. The democratic element of our mixed constitution, the People's House, has been stretched so thin by a century-old freeze that the individual citizen has nearly vanished from the representative's field of vision. Now, let me show you the second narrowing because it works on a different part of the same problem. The first challenge was every representative being distant from their constituency. The second makes it so that you, as a constituent, have almost no real choice about who that distant representative is. Here's the classical standard again. For Aristotle's polity and Polybius' democratic element to be real, the many must be able to genuinely contest power, to put forward their own candidates, to challenge the incumbents, to translate a shift in popular opinion into a shift in who governs. A system in which the contest is permanently fenced off, in which only 2 pre-approved teams are allowed onto the field, and everyone else must clear barriers that those 2 teams never have to clear. It's not a real contest. It's a managed one. And in a managed contest, however many times you hold it, it will transmit the will of the managers more than the will of the managed. I speak about this as someone who has been on the inside of it. As an organizer in third-party politics, what I'm about to describe is not abstract to me. I've lived the mechanics of it. In Pennsylvania, as in most states, the 2 major parties enjoy a privilege the law simply hands them. The candidates are nominated through a primary election. The primary is run and paid for by the taxpayers, by all of us, including those of us who do not belong to any major party. The major party candidate's path to November ballot runs through a public, state-administered election. The candidate does not gather signatures to get there in the general. The state machinery carries them. Even if they go uncontested, the state machinery moves them into the November election. A minor party or independent candidate gets no such machinery. To reach the same November ballot, the candidate must gather signatures on what are called nomination papers, and then survive a challenge of those signatures. For a statewide office in Pennsylvania, the current requirement is 5,000 valid signatures. Now, 5,000 may not sound like a wall, and I want to be scrupulously honest because standards in some states and some areas are much, much larger. Pennsylvania's current statewide number is not the most brutal, but it's still very difficult. To raise money to petition people for signatures is a difficult process. And then that money is not used for getting your campaign message out. No, it's just used to harvest signatures, to get you access to the point where you can start to debate. Now, there have been times in the state's history when the formula floated the requirement into the tens of thousands. So yes, 5,000 signatures is a barrier, but it has been much worse. And over the years, certain barriers have been brought down through court battles that third parties such as the Libertarian Party have fought for. And the Libertarian Party in Pennsylvania currently holds a limited qualified status that governs its certain advantages. So I'm not going to stand here and tell you that Pennsylvania is the worst case. It's not. But it is indicative of a problem. And the signature number was never really the entire wall. The real wall is the challenge to that. In Pennsylvania, after a minor party candidate submits his signatures, any private party, and in practice, operatives connected to the major parties are the ones, can challenge those signatures in court, line by line, name by name. And the killing mechanism is historically a candidate who lost such a challenge could be ordered to pay the court costs of the challenger. And that could run into the tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so what does that do to a bootstrap campaign? It cripples it. Not merely do you have to gather the signatures and use all of your political capital early on in your campaign, you then have to defend that. The point remains, it is a hurdle that the major parties do not need to work with. The major party candidate is gliding through on taxpayer-funded primary. They face no equivalent risk, none. And the asymmetry is the point that I'm trying to make. The barrier is not designed to verify a candidate has real support. It's designed to make the attempt itself arduous enough that most people never make it. And the ballot is only the first fence. There are others stacked behind it. The debates, the ones that actually reach voters, they're controlled by a commission that the two parties effectively run. Now, we're seeing that change a little bit with the changing broadcast media, podcasts, etc. But debates typically, they set polling thresholds that were high enough to keep minor party voices off the stage. And then this guarantees the low polling numbers that are cited to justify the exclusion. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Public matching funds available in some races flow on terms calibrated by the two major parties. Even the structure of how votes are counted works against the outsider through the dynamic political scientists call the wasted vote problem. And I'm sure you've all heard about this problem. And voters who might prefer a third option are told that a vote for that option is throwing away your vote. So they swallow their preference and they pick the lesser of two evils. Every one of those mechanisms compounds the others. So what's the strongest counter argument to that? Well, there is a good one. The counter argument is that none of this fencing is really necessary to explain the two-party system, because the two-party system is a natural consequence of how we vote. Political scientists call it Duverger's law. When you elect a single representative per district by simple plurality, meaning whoever gets the most votes win or take all. The mathematics drive the system towards two parties all on their own. No conspiracy required. Voters consolidate around the two candidates with a real chance winning because backing anyone else risks splitting your side and handing victory to the other. On this account, minor parties fail, not because the ballot is fenced, but because the voting math makes them spoilers, and no amount of ballot access would change that underlying logic. This is a real phenomenon, and I will concede it does genuine work. The wasted vote dynamic is real. Duverger's law describes something true about plurality voting. We can't wave that away. But here's what the concession cannot explain. If the two-party outcome were just the natural, inevitable result of the voting math, if the duopoly were protected by mathematics alone, then the incumbents would not need any fences. They would not need the lopsided signature requirements, the ruinous challenge cost mechanisms, the rigged debate thresholds, the calibrated matching funds. The math would protect them for free. The fact that the two parties have built and fight ferociously to maintain an elaborate apparatus of legal barriers against competition is itself the evidence that they do not actually trust the math to protect them. You do not spend that much effort guarding a door that cannot be opened. The very existence of the fences tells you the duopoly fears what would happen without them. Duverger's law may push toward two parties, but the law of the land is doing a great deal of additional pushing just to be sure. And that additional pushing is a choice made by the people the fences protect. And it's not consistent with the genuine contest a polity is supposed to be. So now we have both problems in view. The first stretched the representative so far from the citizen that the individual nearly disappears. The second fenced the ballot so that even the choice of which distant representative to send is confined to one of two managed options. Put them together and you have a people's house that is neither very close to the people nor freely chosen by them. The forms of the democratic element are still standing, but the substance has been drained out. It's been hollowed from two directions at once. This is the hollowing out that Aristotle warned about, that the polity has become in function something else wearing polity's name. Let us end this analysis with a thought experiment, one that reveals something that neither of our challenges have shown yet. The two problems I've described are usually treated as separate. I want to suggest they share a single root, and that one change strikes at both. Here's the experiment. Suppose we did what the founders assumed that we would always do. Suppose we unfroze the House and we restored something closer to the founding ratio of representation. What would happen? First, the arithmetic. And let's do a range instead of a single number because the argument does not depend on the most aggressive version. I mean, the most aggressive version would be if we returned it to the floor of 30,000 members per district, our House would be 11,000 members. And that certainly would fit into Madison's thought process of unworkable. So set that aside as the outer bound. One representative per 100,000, 3,400 members. One representative per every 50,000, 6,800 members. Even if you cut it in half, and you put it at around one member per every 400,000 members, that would about double the size of Congress, taking it to about 870 members. Even in that most cautious reform, a dramatically larger House, what would that do to our problems? Let's take the first problem, the distance. Cut the distance from 765,000 to 100,000. And you have a district that's the representative can reach. A district of 50,000 is a place where a person could actually campaign on foot, on a modest budget, by knocking on doors and showing up at meetings. The constituent stops becoming statistically negligible. Your letter is one of a few thousand, not one of 750,000. The representative can once again be known, reached, and most importantly, held accountable. That was the entire point of the People's House. But here's the part that connects to the second challenge, the fenced ballot. And this is the move that I personally find genuinely interesting. A district of 50,000 or even 100,000 is radically cheaper to contest than a district of 765,000. The smaller the district, the less money a campaign requires, the fewer signatures a ballot petition demands in absolute terms. The lower the wall an outsider has to climb. The whole apparatus of fences I described a moment ago, the signature thresholds, the challenge costs, the money advantages, it derives much of its power from the sheer scale of modern districts. Shrink the district and you shrink the barriers along with it, almost automatically. You make it possible for a candidate with genuine local support and very little money to win a seat. Which means you make it possible for someone who is neither a Republican nor a Democrat to win a seat. Not in spite of the system, but because the system has been returned to a scale a normal person can contest. And now follow that one more step to the consequences the major parties, I guess, would least enjoy. If thousands of these smaller seats became winnable by candidates outside the two parties, libertarians, Greens, constitutionalists, regional and local movements, independents of every stripe, the two-party duopoly, it could not survive in its present form. You'd get members who belong to no major party, You would get blocks and caucuses that cut across old lines. You would get, in short, what most of the world's democracies actually have, and what the rigid American duopoly has spent a century preventing. A legislature of many factions, forced to assemble coalitions issue by issue, to negotiate, to build agreement across difference in order to govern at all. So let me be clear about what the thought experiment is actually proposing and what it is not. I'm not actually proposing more government. I'm proposing more competition for power and more faithful transmission of the people's voice, both of which are checks on government, not expansions of it. Again, consider what we're talking about in a mixed government. You need the check of the people against the Senate and against the presidency. So consider what a chamber of many factions and shifting coalitions actually does to the exercise of power. A House of 435 organized in two disciplined parties can be whipped. When one party holds the majority, its leadership can move sweeping legislation on a party line vote, with the individual member being reduced to pressing the button the leadership tells him to press. That's a chamber built for efficient exercise of concentrated power. Now picture a House of several thousand members fractured into dozens of factions, where no single bloc commands a majority and nothing passes without genuine negotiation across lines. That chamber is far harder to capture, far harder to whip, far harder to use as an instrument for imposing the will of a narrow leadership on a continental nation. It is, in a word, a weaker legislature, slower, more gridlocked, more prone to stalemate. And for those of us who believe the gravest threat to liberty is the easy, efficient exercise of centralized power, a weaker, more fractious, harder to capture legislature, that's not a bug, that's a feature. It is precisely the break the mixed constitution was supposed to provide. It is Polybius's balance restored by arithmetic. So the thought experiment in the end is not really about the number of representatives. It is about returning to the democratic element of our mixed constitution to a scale that actually works, close enough to the people to be accountable, open enough for competition to be genuinely chosen, and fractured enough to resist capture by any narrow faction, whether that faction calls itself a party, a donor class, or a leadership. One change: restore the ratio, strikes at both problems at once, because both problems grew from the same root. A chamber that stopped growing with its people, and in stopping, drifted out of the people's reach. On Saturday, we ended with Cicero on the road to Formay, and the warning that republics can die slowly, by a long slide of compromises that no single generation quite notices. The narrowing of the People's House is one of those slides. No prescriptions list, no soldiers on the road, just a quiet vote in 1929, and a thicket of ballot laws accreted over decades, each small enough to ignore, together large enough to drain the voice of the people from the one chamber meant to carry it. But here's the difference between our slide and Cicero's, and the whole reason this series exists. Cicero at the end had no republic left to flee to. We do. The structure still stands. The Constitution still names 30,000 as the floor. The House can still be unfrozen by an ordinary act of the same Congress that froze it. No constitutional amendment, no arduous petitioning process, just a simple vote from the Congress. The ballot law can be opened by the ordinary changes to the ordinary law. Nothing about the challenge is irreversible. It was done by human choices, and it can be undone by human choices. The candle Madison read by is still burning, and the design he worked from is still legible to anyone willing to read it. That is what the classics teach us about democracy. Not that the many are wise and should rule unchecked. Aristotle and Polybius and Madison all knew better than that, and so should we. But that the democratic element must be real for the whole mixed constitution to hold. a polity that just keeps the forms of the popular government while actually draining out its substance, that's begun its slide towards something else. We talked about that. The remedy is to actually restore the substance. The voice of the people is not gone. It has only been muffled. Next Saturday in episode 3, Athens, Jerusalem, and the House of Wisdom. The thread winds beyond Greece and Rome. We turn to the Hebrew covenant tradition and its radical claim that the king stands under the law. And then to the astonishing story of how Islamic scholars in Baghdad and Cordoba preserved the Greek inheritance and handed it back to the West after they had forgotten it. The golden thread, it turns out, runs through more civilizations than most basic school books tend to admit. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been episode 2, part B of Self-Evident, The Road to 1776 on the Consequential Actions podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com. Then you'll find all written articles emailed to you as they come out. You also see our previous series on the General Welfare Clause, the New Leviathan, and the Empire of Liberty. And if you want to help me defeat the algorithms and make sure this show gets out to a broader audience, please subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Action Podcast for video versions of all podcast episodes. And also, follow me on X, @JKellick, for updates, discussions, and announcements. We continue to post articles and really do welcome your participation. Until next time, have a great day.